So when we looked at this particular video, what it basically gave us is an insight of what all does cybersecurity encompass and why do we need it. And it basically ended by saying that some of the organizations could look at all these components and come up with something called a cyber defense strategy, because of the fact that the number of connected devices are nowadays increasing. And a very simple example that I would give you in terms of how you need to look at that would be, if you log into the router admin panel of your router at home, wherein you have the internet, and obviously log into that panel, you would be able to log in and see how many devices are connected to that particular, basically connected to the internet through that hardware. So in my case, if I look at the office, there are probably about 10 PCs max, projector, Apple Play, there are about 21 devices which are connected, and each of this device needs to be secure so that it does not allow anyone outside the network to gain access to, the network at UK Versity. So in this case, there is a Wi-Fi password, and we keep changing that password time and again. And the reason we do that is to try and prevent people remembering the passwords on their phone, on their devices. And sometimes when you're in the vicinity of it, even if you're not connected, meaning to connect, but what tends to happen is your device detects the Wi-Fi and connects to it, brings, slows down our network. So some of these basic things we do in the business world are also very closely mimicked, at home, because sometimes you have so many connected devices, you want to get rid of your phone, your old tablet. What you do is you change your password rather than be bothered about, switching the Wi-Fi network off on that device. So this has become a very important field, and the field, is becoming more and more important because of the number of devices which are now being connected to the internet or allow you to connect to the internet. One of the things which I'll also mention, if we go 10, 12 years back, or go say 15 years back, you would normally see that PC or Windows PC was the only device or a preferred device to connect to the internet. So if you had to go onto the internet, there were no tablets, there were no smartphones, or at least internet browsing on the smartphones was very slow, even if they were there. But the main device through which you used to connect used to be a PC. So you had an antivirus software on it, some sort of a security software on it. But as the devices which are now getting access to connect to the internet increases, what is happening is your threats to people getting access to that information is also increasing, and that is where cybersecurity is becoming important. Now let's look at some of the assessment criteria, with this background, which are what we need to cover in this first learning outcome. Now, the first one basically talks about explaining the importance of cybersecurity and why do you need to understand, cybersecurity. So, as we discussed initially, that we need to be able to connect to the internet, but when systems and devices are connected to the internet, we need to be able to prevent those, those devices connected to the internet to open up, them to vulnerabilities. That means unauthorized access, or essentially gaining access to the information which is stored on the devices needs to be prevented. So this is the basic essence of what would be cybersecurity. Now, in order for us to understand that why it is important and why do we need this as a particular process, we need to look at a couple of things to get that understanding. And those bits that we look at in terms of how do we protect the data and the information and why do we need to protect it is important, because we need to be able to protect ourselves, the organization that you work in. Sometimes you have sensitive information or data that needs to be protected. It could be personal identity information or data like your passports, your date of birth, things like that, birth certificates, your health information, for example, and personal information, not just related to your records, but could be demographic information, could be other sources of information that is personal to you. Your photographs, your pictures, you don't want that to go online. And in those cases, what we need to do is we need to be able to protect that information from people who want to get access or unauthorized access to it. We also need to look at, understanding cybersecurity, because there is now legislation in place which requires us to ensure that the information that you store for individuals or organizations, or if you collect data, we look at a very basic thing, which is a cookie. Sometimes when you go onto a website, you normally see a browser. You open the website on your browser and it will say accept those cookies. Now the reason why they are giving you a prompt to say that these you need your computer, when you try and browse their website, they need to ask you to accept that in that cookie is basically they are asking you to allow them to collect information about you, your behavior, and how you're going to browse and what sections you're going to browse on their website. So when we look at collection of data by organizations anonymously or for reasons when you are on their website or on some of their properties, in terms of virtual or cyber properties, which are predominantly blogs, websites, it could be, for example, forums and other things that you go to. So in those cases, what kind of regulations are there in place in order to protect your identity and the data that you leave behind when you're browsing those websites are all covered under compliance now, and that is the revised Data Protection Act, and it covers that under the GDPR regulations. We look at that in a bit more detail on the next slides. And last but not the least, why it is important for us to understand this is because as more and more devices, I've said this earlier, get you access to the internet or are remaining connected to the internet, they then over a point in time need to be updated. Software on them need to be updated. And if they are not updated or if updates are not provided, then in some cases it leaves out holes or essentially pieces of code, which then allows people to gain access or a backdoor entry into that particular device, which allows them to gain access to your information. So when we look at people, looking at getting access to information, they look at always these backdoor, entry loopholes, which are then, sometimes prevalent in devices over a point in time when the softwares become updated or the device firmware becomes outdated, and that opens the device up to vulnerabilities wherein people who are trying to get access to this data then get that through the backdoor entry. Now, to look at some of these points that I've covered in a bit more detail, I've drawn up some individual slides. So when we look at GDPR, now GDPR is a minefield. There is lots of things which were changed in the Data Protection Act of 1998, and it was re-implemented. It conformed to a central kind of a law legislation being created across the EU, and that meant Journal Data Protection Regulation. And companies, businesses, organizations this was introduced in 2016, and companies, businesses, organizations were given 2 years to be able to implement this fully within their organization. And in 2018, this has become pretty much a norm across the EU. Now, there are various principles of GDPR. There are lots of sections, articles, and subsections within this regulation, which you can obviously read, in a bit more detail should you wish to, which is on this blog of Digital Guardian. Now, what it does in essence is basically these 7 things which are described in the UK GDPR rules implemented in the Data Protection Act. First and foremost, it basically, when you go to a website or a device which basically connects you to the internet, a couple of things that it asks you to do is that if it is going to collect information, it will ask you to collect information, and when companies employ it in terms of making sure that they are compliant with this legislation, they have to ensure that they are collecting data in a very fair and transparent way. So if you go to a website and it doesn't pop you a cookie which says that, we are going to be looking at this, do you accept these general guidelines for data collection, then that would mean that they are implementing the first principle of GDPR, which is to ensure that if they are going to collect data about you, your browsing habits and the behavior that you're going to do, or how you're going to browse the website, which sections you go to, and if they do not serve your cookie to give you a piece of information that this is being done, and you accept it or reject it. If you accept it, it should allow you to browse the website. If it rejects it, it takes you to a bit different page or redirects you to a different page, saying that you do not have access to this site because you've kind of declined to allow the website to collect some basis pieces of information. Now, how this information is collected, how is it stored, how is it distributed, is it shared with third parties? All of that is covered under lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. Then the company, which is, or the website or the domain, whichever property where you put it across, if it collects information, it has to tell you what is the purpose of collecting that information. Will that information be shared with third-party sources? Will it be used for advertising? They have to declare that, and that is normally given in the terms and conditions when you accept that cookie. Should you wish to go in and look into a bit more detail, that is something that you can do, and that would allow you essentially to look at what is the usage of that data that they would do when they collect such data in your case. So if I just show you a broad example of the website, now I've opened up the Guardian website, and as you can see straight away, it is popped up this particular implementation of GDPR to say it's your choice. Are you happy to accept this cookie? Now, what all is going to be accepted when you're signing your life away by, say, in a way, to say, yes, I'm happy. They are going to tell you what is their cookie policy, what is their privacy policy, who are the partners with which the information is shared, and you can decide to manage these cookies by clicking on it, because it will allow you to understand whether this is going to store information. You can switch it off. Is it going to be used for personalized serving messages to you because of localized, geolocation today? A lot of these providers are able to, understand your browsing habits and then serve you ads and, advertising messages. So you can switch this off. And as you can see, it talks about other things like ensuring security, preventing fraud, delivering ads, what are the basic essential cookies that you would need to accept even if you decide to browse this website, and what are the essential other cookies. And should you wish to save and close, obviously make some changes and save and close. And these are, as you can see, in terms of third-party advertisers, they are going to be sharing this data with so many of these companies. So sometimes when you start getting emails after browsing a website, we don't understand that we've gone in, and obviously what we've done is just straight away accepted the cookie, and that allows these websites to then share the data with third-party sites, and they start picking up, and then they start actually sending you emails, and that is where we see the whole thing actually opening up. So this is the first basic step which it changed in the Data Protection Act, is to ensure that the data being collected, you should be aware of it. What is the limitation? What is the purpose of collecting that data? How it can be minimized? Which particular areas you can switch off? So there is a bit of a freedom and independence given to the user who's coming to browse the website to say, okay, I don't want this data to be shared, or I don't want this to be shared with third parties. So that is where collection of data minimization comes in. Now they need to accurately tell you and maintain this data. If they are collecting it for various purposes, you have the ability to be able to write to the DPO or the data protection officer to be able to ask them formally to remove any pieces of information that they have collected and have stored it on their database. That is something which is well within your right, and this is something which was introduced in the GDPR regulation. Now, data can be stored for a number of years, but there is a limitation in terms of how indefinitely it can be stored. It is something which is covered under the GDPR. And then when we look at integrity and confidentiality, a lot of these organizations which are collecting the data have to ensure that the data being collected is actually secure, does not fall or get hacked by for unethical reasons from within their servers, and they are held accountable. So if they are found in breach of these regulations, the Act allows the government, or in this case the Information Commissioner's Office, to actually fine the businesses and organizations for a maximum up to, there is a minimum fine of £10,000, but there is no maximum. I think one of the rulings which happened a couple of years back after the GDPR was implemented, a firm was fined 20 million euros because they were found in serious breach of data and data collection guidelines under the GDPR Act. So it is one of the key bits that we need to be aware of when we talk about why is it important for us to understand cybersecurity? Because this is one of the cogs in the wheels wherein you would need to know if you work within the IT and if your company's website or your company's properties like different websites, domains, forums, blogs do not comply with these guidelines, then the company could be liable for a fine under the GDPR guidelines. Now, the government has also created other guidelines, which is things like protection from the Harassment Act. So basically, it's called the Harassment Act 1997. This act basically, because, over the years, what we see, and sometimes which I'll mention time and again, is that as data is being collected, big data and data being collected is becoming more and more important. What you will generally get to see is that, at some stage, you will generally see at some stage that a lot of organizations collect this data and they can use this data for the purposes of harassing individuals or basically, creating a distress or stress for individuals. So the Harassment Act essentially allows the bodies to basically have something in place as a law, as a legislation, as an act, which basically discourages, the course of conduct which could be used to, say, harass or trouble other people. So this act was essentially introduced, way back in 1997 to deter stalkers, people who basically, let's say, follow other people or basically, essentially look at, let's say, have an obsessive, attention for certain people. So it was used or created as an act essentially to allow, and to allow people from creating unwanted and obsessive behavior against certain people. And this was then also implemented for workplace, wherein employees, sometimes when they say, I'm being harassed, or when you get to hear the term that, my boss is harassing me, which means they're trying to put undue pressure on you for, trying to gain some advantage. And in this case, all these such activities are covered under the Harassment Act. So when you look at name and shame kind of thing, which is now happening on the internet because of the use of social media, is also something which is covered under the Harassment Act. So you cannot publish, for example, pictures of somebody else without prior permission, and you publish them on the internet. Now, sometimes you would see if this happens, then the person can take for whose pictures or anything information has been published, can take the other person to court and can basically use the Harassment Act to say that these are being used to defame or gain unnecessary attention, and all that is a part and parcel of the Harassment Act. Then we also look at the Communication Act of 2003. Now, this act was essentially allowing, as you see, media information starts to flow through the internet, and internet growth and the in terms of the number of connected devices, apart from the PC growing, quite enormously, the act was actually amended, and it basically overtook or superseded the Telecommunication Act of 1984. But in this particular act, what the government has essentially done is they've introduced legal recognition that, or legal legislation essentially to bring radio, TV, broadcast all under one particular umbrella. And this provides, let's say, some sort of, let's say, regulation to, or legislation essentially to be able to regulate this particular sector. So what kind of ads can be aired on the TV, on the radio, on broadcast media or in print media, advertising, ASA, when we look at these service agency, these are various government vehicles essentially which have allowed the government to essentially, look at controlling and what is called legislating the amount of information and the kind of information which can essentially be put up on the internet on various sites, and that is what is essentially the reason why this particular act was introduced. When you look at the Advertising Service or Standards Authority, ASA, that also is covered under this particular act, and obviously what you can print or send to print in terms of adverts is all basically related to guidelines and legislation. I cannot for example, advertise a pill which will say if you take this pill, it reduces, weight in 2 weeks. It has to be approved by the FDA or the MHRA in the UK especially, and then that ad has to have a legitimacy in terms of the information and the claim to the information that it is making. Has it been proved? Has it got scientific backup? And all those things help us to regulate the kind of information which companies, advertisers, individuals will put out. So the main point behind these bits in terms of act and legislation is that if you work within the IT and you have different websites, the company has different websites, and if you put out information online, that would then allow you to essentially be aware that these acts are in place and they have to be followed in order to ensure that the information being put out is accurate and factual. Now, very briefly, in terms of, when we look at what are the various elements when we talk about, cybersecurity. So when we talk about different sections, of cybersecurity and how they work together and how this field as a overall field comes across, you generally see that we talk about, application security. So when we talk about, software, which is, pirated, and this is a big thing which companies like Microsoft, some of the software developers actually, worry, because they've created an IP or a piece of code which obviously has been developed over the years through research and development, and they've spent billions of dollars on it. So what they tend to do is, in order to ensure that the software is not hackable, is not piratable, what they look at doing is basically look at creating what is called application security to make their application secure. But sometimes you would generally see that these application codes and bits are broken, and this allows people to access or gain access to the software or use it without having to pay for it. And in those cases, security of that application or that piece of software becomes important. Then you look at, information on data security, network security, disaster management. These are all bits and pieces that we are going to cover a bit later when we go into the particular task of discussing, what are the various essentials of cybersecurity, and they will essentially be covered in that. But in this first assessment criteria 1.1, what we need to do is, the task was to understand the importance of what is cybersecurity, and with this, we need to get a handle in terms of why this has become important, why is it important for organizations to understand this particular landscape, and what are the challenges it throws forward when they're trying to protect data, information from, people or organizations which are trying to gain unlawful access to it. So any questions on this so far?
No.
All right, okay. Let's go on to the second one in terms of the second assessment criteria, and that talks about describing how do we keep ourselves up to date with what's happening in the field of cybersecurity. What are the new attacks? We get to hear a lot of news. Sometimes we get to hear a lot of news which talks about, that I think one bit of big news which came about was, one of the hotel chains actually a couple of years back, when I say 2016, 17, they had a breach of data, breach of security in their servers, which led to 400 million customers' data being hacked by or getting, access to that data by hackers. So when these kind of things happen, how do we learn about, these kind of, let's say, attacks or, this information? So obviously here the main task is to understand, how do we keep ourselves up to date with what's happening in the cyber world, and, what are the websites, sources through which we can gain meaningful information. Now, when we look at these, we talk about various sources. So obviously there are reports which the government brings out. There are reports that, certain companies would publish on websites, blogs. You would get to hear them in news. And what we want to be able to do in this particular task is to understand how do we keep ourselves up to date with what's happening in the security world, in the case of cybersecurity. So traditional approaches tend to be that we need to be knowing what are the various sites that we need to have access to be able to gain information and keep ourselves up to date with what's happening in this particular field. Now, one such website or the agency is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and the National Crime Agency, NCA. On their websites, they publish regularly information about what are the various vulnerabilities or threats which have been detected, and they normally would try and warn individuals, members of public organizations and businesses about the threats that they need to face. And obviously, they then inform the relevant software organizations or organizations which are providing that solution to be able to bridge that threat. Now, the reason why we need to look at this is because people, which we will term as hackers, are always trying to gain access to, information. Some of them do it for fun. Some of them do it, for example, for various reasons. It could be for maybe creating fraud, gaining financial advantage, gaining access to information, espionage. We look at some of the reasons, but the main point here is to look at describing the sites or sources through which we get updates on what kind of security attacks can happen. And some of these sites are these sites that we need to be aware of. So if you are in IT and you want to keep yourself up to date with what's happening in the field of cybersecurity and what are the sites through which you try and find out that there are attacks happening or vulnerabilities which are detected, then these are the sites that we will be looking at. National Cybersecurity Center, we look at the National Crime Agency, some of the news sites would BBC, Guardian, Telegraph, Bloomberg section of cybersecurity. I've hyperlinked some of these sites, so when you click on them, you should be able to go onto the websites for you to have a look. Technology sites like Wired.com, Computer Weekly, Hackers News, Info Security Magazine, and some of the other software companies which have lots of machines, PCs, devices running their software. You look at Apple, Android, Microsoft, antivirus companies like McAfee and Norton. They are prime sources through which they put out this information that, this particular vulnerability has been detected and this could lead to a bit of an attack, or people getting access to the information, or hackers getting access to this information. And that is where you would cover this particular task up. So any questions on this so far? Describe the sites through which you keep yourself up to date in terms of what's happening in the field of cybersecurity. Simple enough? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The introduction, the illustration is quite understood, and since we also have we provide a material of how we can be able to do some revision and all that, so it's okay. It's okay by me. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So let's quickly get on to the next task, which is primarily looking at, describing a typical mindset of a hacker. Now, before I get into this, what I want to look at is look at understanding what is a hacker. How do we define the word hacker? Any ideas in terms of what is the word hacker?
Yeah, I think yes. Hackers. These are the people who have always tried to steal information from people online, either by email or send such an attachment file for you to download. Also, it also followed by viruses to attack the system which they are using. That is the reason why this cybersecurity you are lecturing us for everyone to know about cybersecurity, to prevent hackers not stealing information and important data from people and all that.
Correct, absolutely correct, spot on. So the technical meaning of the word, or if I look at the dictionary meaning of the word hacker, is somebody as a person who's trying to gain access or unauthorized access. Basically, the key term is unauthorized access to data without your permission, without your knowledge. That person would be called a hacker, and the activity that they engage in would be called hacking. So sometimes, sorry.
Yeah, I'm listening. Yeah.
Okay. So when we look at understanding, who are hackers or what they do, what is it that triggers them to get into this field? So what we look at is typically people who use computers or computer-related products like networking equipment and other things, and are technically very sound and use that to gain access to information, which could be financial information, it could be personal information, it could be information about trade secrets, anything. That process would be, or the activity would be called hacking. So when we look at understanding the task, which says typical mindset, the mindset of hackers is that they are technically very sound, they have very good knowledge of computers and networks, and they basically use this knowledge and the skill set that they have to exploit it for monetary purposes. Now, hacking can be done, or people who get into hacking, or essentially, are called or termed as hackers, they do this for various reasons. Some of the reasons that we can just think of literally would be things like sometimes when you're trying to get access to something and you don't have, you try and steal it. So theft could be one of the reasons. They try and gain access to information or any sort of information which will allow them to make money, financial gains. That could be the second mindset of hackers. The third sometimes could be what we've seen in the US elections and what we get to hear this term, which is fake news, which the ex-president Donald Trump, has used a number of times, is that a lot of organizations are promoting fake news. So in this case, sometimes you would see large organizations, even the political parties, they were looking at driving campaigns which were essentially being done to further their political agenda. So he used this term fake news, but his idea of using the term fake news was to basically, further a political agenda to say that, okay, there are people transpiring against him, but, at the end of the day, nothing was found. So sometimes you would see that you employ people who are experts in IT to be able to forward let's say, present a particular agenda. So in some cases, you would look at sometimes people with the excellence and brilliance of working in IT and knowledge of IT would be used, in this case, for hacking, and there would be to basically, bombard people with some sort of messages or a type of messages, and that could be for political agenda. Sometimes you would also see that people who are good in coding, programmers, just do it for the sake of fun. They like breaking things up, or they like, disabling a site, or, disabling a device, or, something like that. So when we try and understand the typical mindset of a hacker, it is very difficult. A lot of people are driven by lots of different things. It could be, in general, when we think of the word hacker, we always think of, people who are going to, do things which are essentially going to be, malicious. But sometimes you also get to hear a term which is called ethical hacking. Ethical hacking is a process through which, you're basically, there would be people essentially who would work for organizations, but their work would be related to finding out what could be vulnerabilities in an application, a system, or an organization's infrastructure. And their idea would be to try and work with the organization, or they might be employed within the company business organization to try and find bugs within the applications or various systems in order to minimize those vulnerabilities when the company starts selling its products and services. So the devices become secure, the software becomes secure. So a lot of companies like Apple, Microsoft, or a lot of software companies like LinkedIn, Google today employ ethical hackers as employees, and it's a big business. Some of these people are given the tools and techniques to be able to hack into the system, because the companies are trying to develop solutions which are going to be robust enough and, very sound and, code-wise, programming-wise, absolutely like fortresses which do not allow people trying to gain access to it, possible. So ethical hacking would be good side of hacking, wherein people would be computer experts or computer security experts, and they would be essentially looking at testing different methodologies, different programs, different codes, and they would be trying to prevent hacking happening into a system, and they work synergistically with the organizations, and that is why it will be termed as something called ethical hacking. Now, when we look at typical mindset of hackers, some of the slides which I put together, we look at theft. People are looking at hacking because they're looking at financial fraud. This is an old estimate. If you look at financial fraud is happening predominantly because of identity theft. It could be for espionage, for trying to get hold of patents or information about particular products and devices, and that would be termed as espionage. It could happen at a country level, wherein a lot of cyber attacks which the UK has faced, I think in 2018-19, when we had the computer system of NHS going down, and there were these attacks which had come in from Russia. And, sometimes you would see that they are done primarily to cripple the economy, to cripple the system, and they are done predominantly to, create let's say, inconvenience, and they would fall under different brackets. So we will look at theft, because it is going to be financial, look at espionage, we look at spamming, we look at controlling. Sometimes you would see that there are distributed controlled attacks which are done on different websites by hackers because they want to bring the website down, they want to slow down the traffic, they want to divert the traffic. And we've seen that happening with a number of news that we read about Bitcoin, and some of the hackers which basically work for Bitcoin or essentially are interested in gaining access to computer, installed capacity. They then look at using some of these internet-enabled devices to take control of them by installing softwares, which we will discuss again, like Trojan Horse, malware, phishing software, the keyboard logging software, which basically allow these different type of activities to happen. They can also be used to create disruption. Good side of things would be vulnerable testing, which is ethical hacking, and sometimes people do it for fun because they would want to test their skills. They would want to, be driven by enthusiasm and passion to say, okay, let me see how good a programmer I am. Can I break this code? Can I get into this site? And sometimes it is primarily done for the purposes of experience and fun. So when we try and understand the mindset of an hacker, what we are trying to understand is that why hacking as an activity is done, what are the various type of activities which are undertaken by hackers, and what are the main financial gains which can be done by people having access to unauthorized information or gain access to unauthorized information, and that is what we need to cover in this particular task. Now, the next one that we're going to go into is understanding the different types of malware that exist. Now, one of the first things that we want to do is basically understand what is malware. Now, malware is defined as it's a collective name essentially for a number of different pieces of code of software, which can include variants of various software. It could include viruses, ransomware, spyware, which could be installed on devices or devices which connect to the internet without the prior knowledge of the user. And they are basically used to gain access to information. So if sometimes when you get an email, what we do get to see is that is an email which has come and you see that, okay, this is something which has come to me. I'm a bit surprised that I've not ordered anything, but they've sent me an invoice and it's a zip file. So what they're trying to do, what the mail is intended to do is essentially asking you to open the file by tricking you that you bought something. But when you run that piece of software by opening the file, it installs a malware on your system, which could be any type of malware, things like a virus, a Trojan horse. It could be a phishing software, a keyboard logger. It could be something in terms of spyware, which basically gets installed on your PC or your device and then relays information back to the person who has sent that off. So a malware is a collective name which is normally given to a piece of software, a code or a program which allows people to gain unauthorized access to your device or your network or information within your network or in a business or an organization. Now, there are different types of malwares that you can look at, but essentially they are used primarily to gain access to the information, spy on other people's information, and they would basically be done without your permission or knowledge, and that is why it is termed as malware. Now, this task talks about asking us to cover various types of malware. Now, have you heard about various types of? Have you heard about malware? Can you think of any malware or anything that you've heard which has been classified as a malware? Have you come across that?
Yeah, I've come across it, but I really don't know the meaning.
Okay, and any malware that you can name that you're aware of?
No.
No, okay. So no worries. So there are different types. There are 10, 12 different types of malwares, and I've listed a few very common types here. Now, one of the types of, so what is malware? Let's remember, malware is basically a piece of software, a code, which allows you to gain access to unauthorized access to a piece of information, either on a network or on a device or any sort of device which is connected to the internet without your prior knowledge and permission. So what are the different types of malware? Worms. Now, they are a piece of software which basically are used in phishing attacks. They are basically small pieces of code which can basically be sent across through email or through text messages in certain devices, or certain types of software, when they are being installed, can have this piece of code integrated in them. And what they do is they basically go in and delete files on your computer. They can modify files. They can install or run a piece of software in the background without the main software knowing about it. And in some cases, this is predominantly used to steal data. This is primarily used as a piece of program to gain a backdoor entry into accessing your device. So this is a very common piece of malware which we get to see, which gets circulated through emails. Viruses, we are aware of. One of the reasons why you employ or deploy antivirus software on your PC, on your Mac, or any sort of an internet-related device. Today, people are installing antivirus softwares even on their phone. So Norton has introduced an antivirus for Android phones, and what you generally get to see is that these are again programs which basically infect your operating system. The key word here is operating system, the key system which actually runs your device. So when you look at a PC, you have various types of operating systems. You have Linux, Unix, different forms of Unix like Ubuntu. You have Windows, and then you have Google Android, which is now being installed on Chromebooks. Now, if the system gets infected by a piece of software which is going to affect the main system which runs and provides you the graphic user interface or GUI, then in those cases, those programs are going to be called, viruses. Then we talk about bots and botnet. Now, a bot is a computer that has been infected with malware and can be remotely controlled by the hacker. So sometimes you see a way of using this is by we use a software called LogMeIn or remote logging into a PC. But using that software officially through authorized permissions, when it creates a, sometimes when I have a problem on the Mac, I would call up Apple. The customer services from Ireland would ring me up and they would say, okay, can you go onto this website and, type this and then give me the code. What they're trying to do is gain access to my Mac and essentially help me solve that problem. But how they're doing it is they're basically using a piece of software in the background to be able to remotely gain access to a PC to help me solve a particular issue or a problem that I'm facing with the software. But when you have computers which are infected with a piece of software which are allowing you to gain access to the information without you knowing it, and in this case, remotely being controlled by a person who's hacking your PC or your network, would be the use of bots and botnet. And essentially, when we talk about botnets, what we do mean by that is that they are used for carrying out multiple malicious activities. It could be for spreading. It could be for infecting other machines with that bot, software or that particular piece of code. It could be for basically disabling that machine. In some cases, it is also used for spying, and they are one of the reasons or one of the types through which malware can infect your PC. Now, we also talk about, essentially Trojan Horses. Now, Trojan Horses are basically, pieces of very highly specialized pieces of program which basically can disguise themselves. That's the key word. They can disguise themselves into being something legitimate. So you might receive a file and you might have a Word document attached in it, but that Word document also has been modified and has a macro installed or a piece of code installed in it which you cannot or your machine cannot decipher. So sometimes what happens is when you get an email, your email client actually blocks that email saying that, okay, this is a malicious software email which has come, and it basically archives that email automatically or sends it to your junk or spam folder. But when you have Trojan Horses or programs which are termed as Trojan Horses, which are basically disguising themselves under a particular piece of code or software, and then you are asked to download them and you're opening them as a normal program, but at the end, in the back end, it is running another piece of code to install that software on your PC, would essentially be called a Trojan horse. Now, Trojan horse tend to be giving backdoor entry to people who are trying to gain access to your system. So when I say people, I mean hackers. And in this case, Trojan horses can do different types of things like, they can delete files, modify files, capture your data, spy on a device, and they can open up certain ports on your machine, on your network, which will allow hackers to gain access to your network and things like that. So they are one of the types of malware. Now there are other types called ransomware, which are predominantly used in financial fraud. You have adware and scams. Sometimes you open up a website and that website will open up 10 other websites, or pop-ups will start coming up on your screen, and they would be because advertising sites have deployed a software or an algorithm which basically infects your browser with a malware, and that is called adware, which keeps opening up sites or bringing adverts of a particular type of sites, which are trying to promote their products without your consent. And they generally tend to happen with most pornographic sites, or on sites wherein you look at gambling sites and things like that, because they're trying to entice you to subscribe to that content or go on to that particular content. Spyware is primarily for the use of gaining access to your passwords. One of the clean habits that we will see everyone has developed is that when we are on browser today, on Google Chrome, we go on to a website, we type a password, we end up saving passwords on your browser. So imagine if your browser cache or password side of things is hacked, or people get access to it, then this will allow them to gain access to a lot of different sites and a lot of different passwords to different sites, which will allow them to use it for various activities. It could be for gaining personal information, benefits, financial information, your understanding your browsing habits, and all those things, which will then allow them to redirect traffic to your PC or your when you go online and show you similar kind of adverts or sites which you would be more prone to going to, and they are called spyware. And then you have spam and phishing, which is primarily a specific side of emails which keep coming to you again and again, even after you unsubscribe. They keep sending you emails, and the idea there is they want to basically gain access to your account or your email account, essentially, and the information in it to be able to use it for their own personal gains and personal reasons, or for some sort of gains that they want to make. And in those cases, you would generally see spam or phishing software. Now, I see spamming as a particular type of email which comes to you time and again, even after you've requested for unsubscribe or you've deleted those emails. They keep coming back, and that is basically, it becomes very irritating. So we get lots of emails in the organization to say, develop a new website, I'm a designer, I'm at this, I'm that, and we get about 20 such emails every day. After unsubscribing, after asking them to remove us from the mailing list, they're still sending us email. Then what you can do is report them to the Information Commissioner's office, wherein what they will do is maintain a track on that activity and block the IPs or the servers from which these emails are coming. And that is what is the process of spamming and, or getting rid of spamming by making a complaint. But there are laws here now wherein you cannot send an unsolicited email, and they are covered under what are called spamming laws under the GDPR. So these are the various types of malware that you need to be aware of when we talk about if somebody is going to ask you a question, what is a malware and what are the various types, you should be able to explain. There are lots of others, and I put some additional reading that you can do in terms of different types of malwares by going on to McAfee, which is one of the antivirus websites, and it will give you some more information on different types of malware. There are about 10-15 different types. But I've categorized or covered some of the most common ones for the purposes of our discussion today. Now, the last assessment criteria that we look at in learning outcome 1 under PASS is it talks about different type of cyber attacks that can exist. Now, again, there are different types of ways through which hackers can gain access to your information, can infiltrate your networks, or can get access to your information on PC, laptop, any sort of a device which is connected to the internet. And what we need to be able to do in this particular task is talk about these different types of attack or ways through which they can gain access. Now, what I've done is I've summarized some of these on the slide, the cover slide. So attacks could be malware, attacks could be phishing. These are what we have covered in the previous task, so I'm not going to cover these again. But some of the other types of attacks which can happen, I've covered them that we need to be aware of. So they are called man-in-the-middle attack. They are called distributed denial of service, DDoS as we call it. There is something called Sql Injection, DNS tunneling, password attack, business email compromise, BEC. There are lots of others that I've not covered, and I put in a particular link in the plenary towards the end of the slides for you to be able to go onto a particular website and read the different types of cyber attacks that can actually happen. Now let's very briefly look at some of these for the purposes of understanding. Now, what is MITM, or man-in-the-middle attack? Now, man-in-the-middle attack is where the attacker intercepts the communication between two parties. So here, if you imagine a scenario wherein when we look at World War I and II, there was a use of a lot of these radio communications, between various platoons and within the army and various space stations. So what the enemy used to try and do is intercept those communications in order to gain access to the information. So something very similar which tends to happen here is that you get to see that here when you send an email, there is a malicious code of software which is installed, which actually sends a copy of that email to somebody else. So this is like a man-in-the-middle attack. That means you're trying to intercept the information between two parties, and the attempt is primarily being done to spy, steal, or gain access to information, again in an unauthorized way. So these attacks are less common these days, as most email and chat systems follow end-to-end encryption. So when you see on your WhatsApp, when you write, sometimes a couple of months back, they updated the system, and now most of the chats that you do between you and your colleague or your friend or your family member is all end-to-end encrypted. So this is one of the ways through which sometimes when you have unsecure communication happening over the network, you could see that the information could be intercepted by man-in-the-middle attack. The most common types that we talk about now are the ones that you should be aware of. One is what is called the distributed denial of service. Now, DDoS attacks are normally where, what tends to happen is that essentially a server would start to disrupt or send high amount of traffic to a particular site. And what you're trying to do is basically bring that site down by doing, attack by sending a lot of traffic, or in the exact opposite would be in some cases, basically not allow the site to be opened by denying the traffic coming to that site. So in those cases, what you would generally see is this kind of an attack in order to bring the site down, deny the use of that service, would be called DDoS. And this is primarily done when a website or a device is bombarded with traffic in order to bring it down. And this is what we get to see, which tends to happen with sometimes when you see new software launches from Apple and there's an update happening, 1.4, 1.5, 2 billion, 3 billion users would try and download the update at one point in time in a good way. That brings the server down. And that is why some of these companies, when they launch new softwares, what they do is they do distributed distribution of the software from various servers in various geographies, in various data centers, so that it is available to all the users. But if you see the reverse aspect of it, sometimes you would see it is being done in a way wherein the hackers would basically send a lot of traffic to a particular site in order to bring it down, and that would deny the use of that site or that service to normal set of people. Then we talk about Sql injection. This is a type of attack which is specific to databases that run your site. So your site, your website typically has a database running in the background, and the idea here would be that the hackers would send a program which would typically bring your database or affect your database and bring it down. And that would mean that if you fill up a small form on a website, if you go to UK Versity's website, and on the UK Versity website, if you go and try and fill in an enrollment form, and what will happen is you keep filling that form again and again, but there's a software which has been installed, so what it does is it does not accept your form because the database is being disabled or the database connectivity has been broken. And when you submit that form on the database, you think it has been submitted, but actually the information has not been submitted. And in those cases, you would see Sql injection being used as a way to attack that particular site. You have DNS tunneling. Now, this is a sophisticated attack which is carried out by a very specialist set of people which know how to target a particular site or a DNS server. So when we say a DNS server, essentially what tends to happen is that when you get this message that DNS server is not responding, that means your data network server is essentially being brought down. And the reason when that tends to happen is that you would see that the website is not able to establish connection with the internet, on the internet with that particular server, and in those cases you would see the attack being termed as DNS tunneling. Then you have business email compromise, one of the last ones. It's simple to understand. It's a way wherein hackers or attackers here would target a specific individual, send a number of emails to confuse or to trick you into transferring money or providing that piece of information in order for them to be able to make some financial gain, and they would be called as business email compromise. We also look at what is called password attack. Sometimes you would see that some of the attacks are triggered primarily for you to be able to gain access to passwords or a repository of passwords, and this is normally done in terms of gaining access to the password stored on your browser. And in some cases what they do is when they gain access to that information, they try and break that up because it is encrypted by most browsers. But when they try to break that encryption up or ask you to sign into a particular site by tricking you by sending emails again and again, and in those cases the idea would be essentially looking at password attack. Now this helps us cover the basic criteria that we need to look at from a point of view of covering the learning outcome 1. Now what I want to briefly do is look at the merit task and the distinction task, which is there in the first learning outcome. So if I just flick you over and show you the unit specification, so we have covered essentially, if you see these 5 tasks which are there in the discussion, and now we need to basically look at extending some of the task and task related activities into merit and one of the task into distinction. So it is going to be looking at doing some additional research and essentially doing some analysis to be able to cover this particular task in terms of merit criteria. So the first one talks about what are the advantages of understanding hackers mindset. So we covered a task which was primarily what is the typical mindset of hackers. This task is now being extended for you to explain a bit more to say why is it advantageous for us to understand hackers mindset. So when we understood hackers mindset, we talked about personal gains, monetary gains, financial gains, for doing it for fun, doing it for spying, espionaging, things like that. But now the task is asking you to talk about what are the advantages if you know that the reasons why people actually do hacking. So a very good TED Talk video that I put up here, which I would expect you to watch, would be this particular video, and I'll show that very briefly to you, so that it's an 11-minute TED Talk video, which obviously I'm not going to play on the session, but here the suggestion would be, in order to cover this task and understand the advantages, I would ask you to listen into this video at your own time and then come up with some points that you will basically describe as advantages that are going to be covering this task in terms of what are the advantages of understanding the hacker's mindset. Now, the slide that I put after that video basically allows you to understand that this would allow you to engage with the hackers or people from this side of the community who are highly technical, highly experienced on working on computers, that understand networks and computer technology, and engage with them to do ethical hacking. So the primary reason of why you would want to understand what is their mindset is to understand and engage with them and get them to do work for you or for the organization or for the business, and do that work primarily in tandem with companies and organizations creating software solutions, and they could help them they could be helping the organization in developing the piece of application, maybe quality assuring that piece of software, making sure their regulatory compliance is there, and obviously helps them in advancing and specializing that piece of program or software or code, which would provide a better user experience to its users. And these are going to be some of the broad level advantages that are going to be talked about in this particular, if I shift you over to the slide now, these are the broad level advantages that you'll get to see in the TED Talk video by the presenter. So in this case, my suggestion would be to look at understanding this particular video, which is the TED Talk video by Dr. Tim Summers, and he talks about understanding the mindset of a hacker, and then you have to summarize those advantages after you understood the mindset in order to cover this particular task. Now, in the distinction criteria, what we're looking at is you're looking at evaluating a range of techniques or tools essentially to prevent security attacks and how companies and organizations can actually improve their networks and network security to minimize these attacks happening from hackers who are trying to gain unauthorized access to your information. So in this case, we need to cover some of the points like why do we need to understand cybersecurity? This is an evolving field, and what we see is that there's lots of pieces of development which are happening in this field on a day in, day out basis. And what we get to see is that there are different perspectives which different companies, organizations, and forums are bringing forward to evaluate and understand how these attacks are triggered, where they are triggered from. So sometimes when we say that the attack was triggered, the hackers triggered the attack from China, the hackers triggered the attack from say Nigeria, the hackers triggered the attack from Russia. Now, when you look at these, there are these trends that we need to understand that why do these attacks actually occur from a particular geography or occur, from a particular site, and what are the reasons why these attacks actually take place. So I have kind of summarized a few points from Secure Works, which is a company which has done a bit of a study into understanding the range of security attacks, and they then suggest some of the improvement areas which companies can employ into reducing and decreasing these attacks happening over a period of time. And some of the reasons why these happen today is because the number of devices which are connected to the internet is increasing. One of the research studies from Forrester Research actually predicts that by 2025 there will be 75 billion devices connected to the internet. So as a field, if you look at cybersecurity, is going to grow enormously, and what you're going to see is that there will be lots of changes which will happen in this field, and in order to continuously evolve and be at the cutting edge of ensuring that people don't get access to this information, you will need to be aware of the improvements that need to be done in this particular area. And the other bit which I mentioned is the Internet of Things, because that is where devices which are coming out are allowing you to connect to the internet, and data, a lot of data is being collected and stored by companies, organizations, businesses, websites, when I say in general, and that data has lots of personal bits of that data which is being collected, personal data, data which can be used for, again, various reasons, and that could leave you open to vulnerabilities, and that is what we need to discuss in this particular task. So I've explained some of these slides, in terms of the distinction criteria, in terms of why and where we need to make improvements. The reason we need to make improvements is because there's an explosion of data, there's an explosion of Internet of Things, which is the number of devices being connected to the internet, and then what are the areas in which we can look at making improvements so that cyber attacks can be minimized. And these areas tend to be things like, supporting the staff that you have within the organization who understand these threats and can mitigate these threats. You look at conducting trainings and, so that they are up to date and understand most of the new tools and techniques which can be employed in order to reduce these attacks. You look at risk assessments which are done. So sometimes you would see organizations would not allow, if you work within a company and a company has given you a laptop, sometimes what they do is they disable the USB drives in your laptop, because you will be using the device not just in the office but traveling with it, taking it to your home. So what they don't want to happen is have a malicious software, a virus, or a program being installed, and what most companies do is disable the USB devices so that you're not able to connect anything externally to that office equipment, which could come in and compromise the network security of the organization. So risk assessments have to be done. Sometimes you would see that you have to write to IT to explain why do you need a USB port to be enabled, or why do you need the printer port to be enabled, and things like that, and they are all covered under risk assessment. You look at reviewing of your policies and procedures. Sometimes companies would disable some of the sites that can be opened up or accessed within their office networks, things like social media sites, pornographic sites, sites which basically talk about hate and racism. These are sites which are normally blocked by the IT people on the server or on the routing equipment, and essentially. And the reason why they want to do it is they want to put certain policies and practices in place which have been defined and created in the company. And then the last way is to obviously look at always doing assessment. If there are new devices being brought into the organization, sometimes you see organizations go through a big process of bringing over or maybe changing over devices. One of the examples that I would give you is if you look at a large company, before they moved on from Windows 7 to Windows 10, the IT department would have procured a few PCs, would have done a full amount of test on it to see all the other softwares working, what are the risks, what are the things which might bring up issues or problems. And the reason why this was done in many organizations, when they move a platform like this or do a transformation of taking up a new platform or a new operating system, is to assess and also to improve, to see if will it bring improvement in terms of productivity, efficiency, or will it be more tedious and cumbersome for them to be able to do trainings for the employees, because the software is changing, they might not understand the software, and you might need to do training, spend money, by bringing in an external company. And the idea there is whether they would want to evaluate essentially to see whether this particular upgrade or if migration which needs to be done is going to be smooth enough, is going to be beneficial for the company, would increase effectivity, productivity, save time, save costs. And those things are done under the assessment and improvement side of things within the organization. Now, last but not the least, when you talk about, ISO 27001, this is one of the standards which has been introduced, which provides a comprehensive guidance on risk management. So when organizations look at changing systems, moving over to new networks or new devices, the organizations need to look at doing management of risk. And the ISO 27001 is a part of the compliance under the International Standards Organization, which essentially allows organizations to look at mitigating risk, managing risks, and look at a system through which this is a system which they can deploy within the organization to manage risk and risk assessment, related activities, which basically minimizes. It could be generally deployed not just for cybersecurity, but for other forms of risk as well. But this would, include something related to cybersecurity, and as a result, as a net or an end result, would look at reducing the number of attacks which the organization or organization's network can get or have if this has been implemented. So the distinction task, in short, is going to be a bit of study, self-study. You'll have to look at, finding out what are the ranges of security attacks which can happen in organizations in particular, and in its systems, and then what are the areas through which improvements can be done. And these areas I've identified as bullet points here, and you would maybe look at elaborating one or two by taking up an example to cover this task up in the assignment. So with this, what we will do is cover the first learning outcome, and I'm going to stop the session here. And at this moment, I'll take questions if you have on what we've discussed today. So any questions on today's discussion on the learning outcome 1?
No, I don't have any questions. And I think you will send all these materials so that we can be able to also do some revision in outside of this lecture. Is that correct?
That's fine.
Yeah, okay.
That's perfectly okay. So this presentation is now up on Moodle, as you can see, which says Learning Outcome 1, New. And when you click on this presentation, it will allow you to see the slides and obviously, gain access to the recording as well. The recording is going to be uploaded just after the session.
Okay. Are you going to send all the login details?
Yeah, login details, yes. That's something I can ask Dania to resend that to you if you haven't got it. But will be sent and it should be with you.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. Any other questions? Okay, that's great. So what I'll do is I'll end the session and I'll catch up with you to cover Learning Outcome 2 on Tuesday, and we'll see you then. Take care. Bye for now.